Hi friends, it's Darshan Santan and welcome back to another video on math here. And in this video, we'll be talking about inverse functions. Right? In this first video in a series of videos about inverse functions, we'll be taking a more conceptual look at what inverse functions are and where they really come from so that you have a good framework with which to actually go and attack all the problem solving you will be doing in subsequent videos. So that said, let's get started. So the first frame of reference we start with is with inverse operations. You might have seen these when you were younger, when you're doing lower level math, but inverse operations are basically operations that undo certain other operations. So an inverse operation basically undoes a certain operation. To give you a picture of what I mean. So let's say we've got these operations here. So if I have some number, let's call that C, I multiply it by 10 and then add 3 to it, all right? Now what would I do? What other operations would I do to get back to that number C? What would I have to do to get back to C? Well, for starters, I would have to subtract 3, right? To get rid of that plus 3 there. Secondly, I'd have to divide by 10 to get rid of the multiplying by 10, right? So this is basically what inverse operations really are. You're just undoing these other operations that you've already done. Now, if this seems confusing to you, let me put this in another way. You do this all the time while solving equations, right? So for example, if I gave you an equation that said, solve the equation 5x equals 5, well, how would you do this? Well, first thing you'd do is you'd divide both sides by 5, right? You'd be dividing both sides by 5 because you want to get rid of that multiplication that's being associated with the x here. You want to get the x by itself, so you want to get rid of that 5 that's being multiplied to it, and therefore you use an inverse operation of multiplication, which is division, to get rid of the 5. Alright, so that's basically what an inverse operation is, and this is really what sets the framework for what an inverse function does. So now let's go ahead and talk about inverse functions. An inverse function, like an inverse operation, undoes the work of the original function. That's basically what it does. So let's say we have a function here, a function of y equals 3x plus 2, and let's say we plug in a number 5 into it. So 5, you multiply by 3, add 2, you're going to get an answer of 17. Now let's run this through the inverse of this function. This is the inverse of 3x plus 2 is x minus 2 over 3. Just take my word for it for now. We'll discover how to find inverses in a later video. But if I take this 17 and plug it back into this inverse, what's going to happen is I take that 17, subtract 2 from it, and then divide by 3. I'm going to get 5 again, right? So as you can see, the inverse function just basically goes ahead and undoes all the whatever work your original function does on any number, right? So that's basically what an inverse function does. Now let's take a little more mathematically rigorous definition of what an inverse function is. So we've seen what it does. Now let's just sort of put this in fancy math terms. So the input of your regular function is going to be the output of your inverse function, and vice versa. Now you may be a bit confused by this, so let me just go ahead and put this in some mathematical notation just to help you see what it means. So let's let f of x and f negative 1 of x be inverses. So let's use a different color here. So if f of x, okay, basically what this means is that f of x equals y, okay, some number y. If f of x equals y, then what this means is that the inverse of y, you plug in y into the inverse function, is going to give you x, right? And just to make this perfectly clear, x is your input, right? Input of, yeah, so x is your input here, but at the same time, it's your output for the inverse function. You see what's going on here? So you're plugging a number into your regular function, you get some output, and that same output, when you plug it into the inverse function, gives you that original input. And again, this makes sense, right? Because if the inverse function is supposed to undo the work of the original function, then naturally, if you plug in y into the inverse, it's going to give you x out. That's basically what I'm trying to tell you here. That brings us to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please do like, share, subscribe, and check out some other videos on my channel. and stay tuned for the next videos on inverse functions. Those are coming out really soon.